Welcome back. So I'm going to start now with the spec maps. I'm calling them spec maps because that's pretty much a generic term we use for them in the industry. However, there are occasions where you have spec maps, but they're used as reflection maps as well. Or you have spec maps and you have to paint a separate map for the reflection maps for the shaders. For our purposes, we're going to call them spec maps, but use them strictly as reflection maps. Because in Modo, we're going to be using global illumination and some ray tracing, so we'd like to see the reflection of the environment in the metal. So for this color map, I have my color map in a folder. And this is harking back to, again, my non-destructive workflow. For my PSDs, I have everything in folders. So within the color map, I have sometimes subfolders that have their own textures in them, so I can organize things appropriately. And sometimes if I have time, I'll go in and name things, such as wire or metal bits, so I have an idea when I come back in what is what. Because sometimes you have quite a bit of layers within a folder. But in order to create my spec map, it's going to be derived from my color map. So I'm just going to take this entire folder and duplicate it and rename it spec. Now I'm going to hide everything and one by one turn them back on and see, and then systematically go through and convert these to spec maps. Now, I want to bring up my photo reference for this. And as you can see, there's a lot of information in these spec maps. And in my opinion, the spec maps are probably the most important maps you're going to be painting because of how powerful they are. Even at very, very far distances, a really good spec map can immediately tell an audience what that surface is, how hard the surface is, how shiny the surface is, how wet the surface is. All those different qualities can be told from the spec map or reflection map, and painting a really good one will help sell your textures when they're eventually rendered by look development TDs. I think this map is severely developed and a lot of people overlook. So I like to spend a bit of time in really studying how my reference, how the specularity and reflection actually exist, so I can try to recreate that in my maps. So I'm looking at this reference now, and there are a couple clues that I can see in terms of what is being reflected and what is kind of matted out with all this grunge. And fingerprints even. So I'm going to go in here and take a look at this color map. And I have a lot of nice detail in here. And one clue in terms of how I want to attack this map is this piece here. It's kind of scratch. I can see that's kind of being matted out in the reflection. So with specularity or reflection, anything that goes towards the realm of black will be completely matte with no shininess, and anything that's towards the realm of white will increasingly become shinier and shinier as it hits pure white. So I want to take this map and just quickly desaturate it, which is Shift-Control-U. And right now I can see the grayscale version of this map. And I can see that this area here is brighter than the surrounding areas. Which is actually the exact opposite of what I want. I actually want this to be darker, so when the reflection hits, this gets matted out on that surface. So, just to see where this goes, I'm going to take this and Control-I, invert it. And already this is much, much closer to what I want. All these dottings, if I look at my color map, and that's another nice thing about bringing my different maps into the same PSD, I can quickly toggle on and off and see the differences between the two to make sure that the textures that I'm painting are going to react the way I want them to. And for this instance, actually inverting this map is perfect. not in all cases when you invert a map will it be perfect. And there will be some further Photoshop work that you'll need to do in order to remedy the issues. But for this is actually very close to what I want. So I can see that everything that's a bit darker is stuff that I want matted out. However, this map is still a bit too bright for me and doesn't have enough contrast. As I can see in my reference, there's a lot of contrast in what's being reflected and what's being matted out. So I'm going to quickly create a levels adjustment, and I'm going to hit Control-Alt-G, and this is going to parent this adjustment layer to this image. So anything I do will only be affected by this image and nothing below. If I Shift Control G again, it unparents it and affects everything that's below this layer, which is not exactly something I want. I want to be able to have complete control over this metal layer. So I'm going to Shift Control G again, and I want to mess with the levels. I want to really get some nice stuff. So already I see some really nice variation that because of the photograph I get all this really nice undulating detail and variation in the spec, which if I were to try to recreate this from scratch, I wouldn't. There are things in here that I just couldn't pick up on based on the color map. Areas that just have a lot of complexity, but basing things off photographs, you can get really nice accurate maps from the photographs. So for this piece, I've just increased the levels just to give some really nice high contrast in these areas. So when it reflects, all these really nice tarnished areas are going to get matted out, and all of these really nice dark reflective areas will shine, which is perfect. So for me, that metal is done. So on to the next piece. This is just basically the edges of this big piece. So I'm going to do the same treatment. I'm going to Shift Control U, and because I have this levels adjustment not baked down into this layer, I'm able to just duplicate it, bring it up, Control Alt G, and tie this to this layer. Now, and I'm supposed to invert that. So I can have non-destructive workflow, follow the same steps, and get exactly what I want. Now, if I bake this levels down into it, there's no way I can make sure that the levels that I paint here, unless I wrote it down, levels I put into this layer will match this one. So this is another nice tip to try to and practice to try to get into, is making sure that you have non-destructive workflows. Because for instance, say this big map here of a bunch of metal is just one map of several maps that you have that have a bunch of metal with this exact texture. In order to quickly populate that to other maps, having these steps and this non-destructive workflow will make your life so much easier when you try to populate the other maps, because you know that this will work. The way you've painted these maps and created these are successful, and so you want to basically keep that success going down towards the other bits of metal that you will paint on any kind of asset. And the same thing goes for any kind of leather or any other texture that you go to. Having that non-destructive workflow is really going to save you a bunch of time. So these two pieces I'm very happy with currently. We'll see once we render it if it's what I want, and that's when we go back and forth into refining the maps. Now onto my next layer. I have this nice decal, and I'm just going to desaturate that, and I'm going to look at my reference. So I can tell that these gold trim areas have a higher reflection than the white. Now there is a bit of reflection in here, but this is hard to tell whether this is from this surface or actually from the glass right here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to stick with what I definitely know, and I definitely know that these gold trim areas are areas that I want to have higher reflectivity. So I want to do that in my maps. So if I look at these currently, it's the opposite. So if I were to plug this into a shader, these white areas are going to go much, much shinier than these trim pieces, which is not what I want. So let's try the same trick. Let's invert it and see what happens. Now this is closer. However, if I look at my reference, these dark areas in here don't seem to be as reflective. In fact, they seem to be about the same reflectivity as the white areas, which is a problem because right now these are the brightest parts on the map. So what do you do? There's a couple ways we can go about treating this, and I'm going to try out one of them. I'm going to have this base layer so I don't destroy anything that I've already done. And I'm going to quickly put a levels adjustment on this. What I'm trying to do is isolate just these white letters. Sorry, white numbers. If I look through this, this is pretty good. So now I'm just going to take my wand and go around and select all these. Now you can do this another way. You can go into select color range and select highlights, and it'll pick up the highlights, but it's also going to pick up all these little dots, which I don't really want. So it doesn't take much longer to just select these. And for right now, I'm going to worry about the numbers only. I'm going to decide later if I want to keep these decals. And then I'm going to hide this layer, and that's a selection. And I'm going to create a curve and just bring these down. Something that I'm happy with, which is good. So now I've matted out all these, and by doing this I have complete control over how I've done this map, which is what I've explained in previous chapters, is making sure that the photographic reference that you use doesn't control you, and that you have complete control over these images, and you have full reign on how you want to manipulate them. And by doing this, I have full reign on these numbers. So say this goes into look dev, and the director or visual effects supervisor sees this, and they say, you know what, we want these numbers to be lighter. We want them to be really reflective. Well, you have this layer here that you can pretty much just turn off, and boom, it's done. Rather than having this baked down into this original layer and then having to recreate that matte, which I have here. So either way, I have two different layers that preserve the steps that I've created. So in the future, if for whatever reason they want changes, you can quickly do this and spit out a new spec map within 5 minutes. If you bake all this down in, you're going to have a tough time spending maybe an hour just going back in and redoing these maps. So, you know, an hour compared to 5 minutes over the course of time on a production really adds up. So for right now, I really like what's going on here. However, I still want to get more of this gold trim isolated and really darken out, blacken out this white. So I'm going to select this again, and Try to isolate this gold trim. And I'm going to select the shadows. And put that in on top. So I've just filled with black on top of this. And so what's happened is the matte wasn't perfect. So what I'm going to do, because this is a separate layer, I'm going to add a layer mask. Go in and bring back some of this detailing. And quickly get rid of some of this. Slowly go back in. Bring back some of this detail. In fact, this brush is a bit too soft, so I want to get a harder edge. Painting on the wrong layer here. Let's go back to the right one. Now doing this is going to take a bit longer, but it's going to provide you with much more control in the end. And in fact, some of this, I'm looking at it now, and I'm deciding I'm going to leave some of this stippling in here. Just randomly. Because that'll give a nice extra level of complexity to the spec map and imperfections, which I think will help sell the illusion. So there we go. So far pretty happy with this. Let's go back to the reference and check it out. I'm going to assume this lettering is the same kind of gold foil with the same reflectivity, so the fact that these are white are perfect actually. It's going to work for me. And now I want to go in and quickly paint out some of these eyesores. From a distance. And there we go. So that's a separate layer. And I'm going to take a look at this again. And what I'm going to try to do is see if I can get more of an isolation on all this to bring up some more of these whites, because currently I don't have much control over the borders over this gold trim yet. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to quickly copy what I've already done. Control Shift C, Control V. That way I have a flattened version of this. And I want to try to extract another matte. And plug this in as a curve. There we go. So now I have this, and I can delete this layer. So now when I look at my reference, all this gold trim is a bit more reflective than the surrounding, and I have that in my maps. Currently I'm going to leave the white of all this black, but I may want to sneak in some more information. And if that's the case, then all I need to do is bring some of this up. There's a couple ways you can do it. I can just decrease the opacity and make sure that this layer is the same opacity. Or if I have to, just bring this back up until it fades out. And in fact, actually, I like this better. I think it's better to have some information in these areas rather than pure black in your spec maps. So I'm going to leave that. And these I'm going to make sure I don't need anymore. Nope. So I'm going to delete these. And so I have a really nice spec map for my clock decal. And I'm going to look at this piece right here. I don't think that should be brighter than the surrounding area, so I'm going to create another layer and quickly just paint that out. Because not always when you transfer the color maps to other maps will the details correspond. So you want to be wary of that. It's not exactly automatic. It'll get you 99% of the way there, but sometimes you gotta paint out some of the rest. So, okay, that's good for me. Now I'm going to go to the next layer. These are all metal bits, same kind of metal. So I'm going to desaturate them, invert them, grab this levels, and plug it in. And my spec map for all the metals done. And for this piece, this is actually the wiring that I originally had. I'm not going to have in this demonstration, so what I'm going to do is, quite frankly, anything I put in here, it's not going to be an issue because it's, I deleted that geometry. So right now, here's my completed first pass of my spec map. So you can see very, very different than the color map, which more often than not is going to be the case for your spec map. So often you have texture painters who just kind of take their color map, desaturate it. I'll show you an example. Take the color map, desaturate it, put a quick levels, and call it done. However, when you plug this into a shader, it's not going to react properly. So given a little bit more time on your spec maps and observation will yield you a much better result. And as you can see, just plug and play from the color map isn't going to work. You really need to finesse it and understand how the surface works. So there's the spec map for this metal. And I'm going to go quickly into the spec map for this piece. Again, copy it, rename it, and then let's just hide everything. We don't need. Start from the bottom. When you do it this way, you don't get so confused. I don't get so confused because I have so many layers. I want to make sure what I'm adjusting is what I want to adjust. So this base color layer is just this metal, sorry, this leather. I have this layer here I've blacked out so we don't get any speck highlight because it's going to be behind the clock dial. And I'm going to look in here and see if... Okay, so this is all leather. And all of it's going to have the same spec attributes. So I'm going to just take this entire layer and merge it down. Control E. It'll save some space in my PSD. And I'm going to desaturate this. Actually, I'm going to make sure I have... Here's my other leather piece. Merge that in. I'm going to well, before I desaturate this, I want to look at my reference. So I can see already that there's some very interesting information going on in the reflection of this leather. It's very old leather and very, very brittle. But what can I already tell is that a lot of the reflection is actually on the surface and not in the cracks, because of the way it's been handled. A lot of people have touched it, and so the leather gets kind of rubbed down smoother, and with the oils on people's hands and just the overall aging of it, you're going to get a lot of that smoothing. And when material like leather gets smoother, it gets shinier. So I'm going to see if I can extract that from my color map. So right now when I look at my detail, I can see that, let me desaturate this. So already this I know is exactly the opposite of what I want. I want all these cracks here to be less reflective. So let's see what happens if I invert it. and already I get much better result. So I'm going to bring the levels down. And already this is almost exactly what I want, which happens. It's not rare, but it's a nice surprise. Because when I flip back and forth, these areas that have been chipped away, they're actually going darker, which is exactly what I want. I want these to be chipped away. So this is kind of a serendipitous accident for me, where a lot of these detailings are going dark and in the crevices are going dark. However, I can already tell that this is not going to work, that these cracks here are going lighter. And in fact, the trim is going dark as well, and I want the trim to be the brightest. So there's a little bit of work that we need to do. And I can even see on this side this isn't proper either. I want that to be a bit darker. So let's go in and remedy that. First thing I'm going to make sure okay, so I'm going to go and select my trim. And I'm actually going to grab it from my color map. See if I can get a matte from this. I'm going to do a screen. What's nice about a screen is that anything that's white will remain and anything that's darker won't. And voila, I've gotten exactly what I wanted. Gotten this trim to be brightest part. And now I have that as a separate layer that I can control. So if we plug this in the shader and they say, you know what, this trim is actually too bright, I can just go in here and bring it down to whatever level I want. But for right now, I like that it's pure white. So now we have an issue with these cracks. And I want all these cracking in here to be much darker than the surrounding leather. So what I'm going to do is go in and essentially trace out these areas. This is a bit of a tedious task, but it's going to help you in the long run. Because in the end, you'll have a nice matte for all these areas that you've traced out. Just want to give you an idea of what I'm doing. So essentially, I'm going to go in and trace out all these areas that have the leather chipped away. I've already done this because for the purpose of the DVD, I think you get the point. But when it's done, you have this. And what I did was I filled it with black just so I could see everything. And what I ended up doing is I just went in and traced out areas that I wanted to see matte out in the spec maps. So I'm going to actually put this in, fold this in, and see how I like it. And yeah, this is much better. So now I have all these areas that are matted out. I'm going to go in and quickly matte out some of this. But this is much closer to the look I want. And go in and just quickly matte out this area here as well. So there you go. And this is currently the spec map that we have. Now let's take a look and see if this is what we want. And I think for our purposes, this is going to be pretty close to what we want. We may need to deviate from this when we see renders, but for the most part, this is going to react the way we want it to. And essentially, we want the cracks to be darker, the gold trim to be the lightest. And now there's areas here that I'm already seeing that aren't working. But again, this is just the fine-tuning stuff that you want to do. I'm not going to go through and do most of it, but you get the idea that you want to go through and just isolate the areas that you know are going to be matted out. So these are the spec maps that we're going to be using. Let me look at the metal. Here's the metal that we want. For this metal, we're not going to see most of this, so I'm just going to give an arbitrary kind of high contrast spec that I think will work nicely. So for this decal, I want these pieces to be brighter and this dark area to be more matte. And there you have it. We're not going to worry about those pieces. Oh, we have some seams here. So we're going to incorporate those as well. And very quickly we can just plug it in, because we have this non-destructive workflow with this levels adjustment here. So now in the next chapter, I'm going to go into creating displacement maps and bump maps and what kind of information you want to put into each.